they had moved Grandma's trunk, so Grandma Florrie's trunk, that Grandpa just, when she died, he just left everything in it. Everything went in this trunk. And so it was this amazing museum of 1915.
Stories That Live in Us is a podcast that inspires you to form deep connections with your family, past, present, and future. I'm Crista Cowan, known online as the Barefoot Genealogist. Counting down to the upcoming celebration of America's 250th birthday, you'll meet families from each state whose stories are woven into the very fabric of America. Tales of immigration, migration, courage, and community that remind us that when we tell our stories, we strengthen the bonds that connect us. So join me for season 2 as we discover From Sea to Shining Sea, the stories that live in us. Do you remember back in 2020 when we were all on lockdown for COVID? I happened to live in a basement apartment. And let me tell you that those first few months were kind of rough. I live alone. I had the Zoom connection to the world like many of us, but the isolation kind of got to me. And that summer, after about 4 months in that condition, a dear friend of mine asked if I wanted to run away for a few days. Straight up I-15, about 10 hours to Montana. And I had spent some time in Montana, different parts of the state during college, but I had never been to Glacier National Park. And so that's where we decided to go. And for the first time in 4 months, I could breathe. Montana is big sky country. It is exactly what it says to be. And it is beautiful and awe-inspiring, but also, interestingly enough, a little isolated. It was a great place to go during the COVID summer because there weren't a lot of people around, even now. So I can only imagine 100 years ago how isolated it must have been for some of the people who lived there. But when you talk to people from Montana, they love it. They love the wide open spaces and the opportunity to spread out. My guest today is a woman named Mary Anne Mercer. She is an author. She was a nurse by profession, and she has lived all over the world. But Montana is home. And as she talks about her home on the range, I hope you'll enjoy her story. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm excited to get to know you and your story a little bit better. It's not often I get to interview people I don't know or have not talked to before. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
So I would love to know a little bit about just you and where you grew up and your family of origin and what you want to share about yourself and your career.
I grew up on a ranch in eastern Montana, farming ranch, but ranching was the main part of it. It also grew wheat. Had 6 siblings. And I lived on the ranch. My grandfather and his what they called a maiden aunt, the unmarried sister, lived with him, was his housekeeper. And we had a community of, there were like quite a few of us. And then you always had one hired man. So that was 10 people at least, in our little household. Grandpa had a separate house very near ours. And so, I grew up, I went to a 1-room country school with my siblings. At one point, we were 6 of the 12 students in the school. So then I went to high school. I decided I wanted to be a nurse, went on to college, did nursing, worked for, a few years. But I'd always kind of wanted to go overseas. My mom was kind of a vicarious traveler as well. I think I got it partly from her. So at one point in time, I had this opportunity to go to Nepal. I was living in San Francisco. I looked at the paper. I was looking at the Sunday paper, and it just said nurses wanted, Nepal. And I thought, ooh, Nepal, that sounds exciting. 3 weeks later, I was on a flight to Nepal, which is, in the Himalayas north of India. And so I spent 2 years in this very different setting, being useful because I was skilled. I was actually a nurse practitioner at that point. And it just after that, my career was international health, or as we call it now, global health. So when I came back from my 2 years there, I thought, I don't think I I don't think I know enough about what I'm doing here. I know medicine, but I don't really know this whole area of global public health. So I went to Hopkins, did a master's, then I stayed on and did more, get a graduate degree, doctoral degree. So that kind of set me for so in a way it was two different directions. One was academia, because when I moved here to Seattle 30 years ago now, I sort of gravitated immediately to the University of Washington, which had an international health department. So it was academia, but it was also the practice of being out there in the field and doing health for people, doing working in public health for people from other countries and other cultures, basically.
During your educational career, did you have the opportunity to go abroad other times or?
Well, before I moved here, when I was still at Hopkins, I had a program. This was back in the late 90s. I had or early 90s, I'm sorry. I had a program for I was the director of a program for prevention of AIDS in Africa.
Oh, wow.
Big job, right? I mean, it was very, very interesting. And my job at that point, as I saw it as I went along, was to I was working with a bunch of nonprofit groups, bringing them together to help them learn what they needed to know to deal with AIDS in Africa, and which was obviously at this point we're talking late 80s, early 90s. What I realized my job was to convince the people that work for these little nonprofit groups, Save the Children Care, those kind of groups. AIDS is not like everything else. You can't just assume you know what to do about it. This is a new problem. People understand it they understand it very differently than you understand it as a health, medical person. So it was really interesting. Then I came here and started also continue when moved to Seattle, I also continued to work in, say not in AIDS, but in parts of Africa and Asia in health.
Wow, that is quite the both academic career as well as career of service.
And learning, yeah.
Yeah,
Learning. Yeah, for sure.
so much. So, how did you go from international health to writing and exploring family history? That seems like kind of an unusual bridge.
A bridge. Well, the first writing was Beyond the Next Village, because after I kind of finished most my academic work. I was still teaching, but I had time. And that I had a journal from, that was this thick from my time in this rural area. And it was such an incredible experience that I kept a pretty detailed journal. And I finally said, we've got to do something with this. I've got to write this up. So that's Beyond the Next Village, which is the book that I wrote, published, it's now a good, probably 10 years ago now. So that sort of made me realize that I had that book in me. And I moved on from that, and it was kind of the Montana book was the same thing. I had this book in me. I felt so invested in my family history and my Montana roots and all that, I just had to write that book too.
So, during all of this time, your time in Nepal, your time at Hopkins, your time in Africa, going through this process of academic and career, um, did you keep in touch with your family? Like, are you a close family? Are you spread out all over everywhere? Did you have other siblings who were following similar or different paths?
Pretty much my brother was, in the Air Force, actually, so he traveled around, but very different. Yeah, I was really the only one that had this, I think like my mom, just this fascination for other cultures and for living in other cultures and really understanding, totally different parts of the world. And so I'm the only one that went that direction. And I think it was partly because my mom had there's a set of books, they're old books that I think came from the 20s or 30s. It's called the Stoddard Lectures. And it's lectures of this guy who traveled through Europe and wrote books about all these ancient sites in Europe. And so I don't know why we had this book, but my mom, this set of books, like about 6 or 8 books, and Mom read them all. She wanted to go to Europe. She wanted to know this history. So, as I say, I think I came by it honestly. I think my mom was the the main source of all this, sort of fascination with other places and
A little bit of wanderlust in her.
a little bit of wanderlust. Yeah,
The Montana connection, is that through your dad's side of the family or your mom's, or are they both from there?
both from there.
Okay.
Yeah, mom grew up in a town, in a small area close to they were living in the same county. Uh, so they yeah met there, and and their parents. My grandpa was actually from Missouri, but my mom's parents had lived in this part of Montana for quite a while.
So you've got some deep roots there.
Yeah, yeah, really.
As you were growing up then, did you have relationships with both sets of grandparents?
That was the interesting part. My mother's family lived basically the other side of town, and the name on this the book that I wrote is has to do with crossing the Yellowstone, because it really is a thing to go from south of the Yellowstone River to north of the Yellowstone River. So I mean, during the time, so my parents got married, moved to the south of the Yellowstone River, didn't get to see, it was just a big thing. I mean, there was no bridge until I think it was the early 30s. So my parents were married, and, it was a big thing to go into town, and you had to take a ferry across the river and all that. So anyway, I growing up, I was not terribly close to my mom's family, who were just north of town, not that far away. But my grandfather and great aunt Katie, who was grandpa's sister, lived right, I mean, not the same house. They lived in the original ranch house, but it was, 50 yards away from our house. So he's the one, and they're the ones that I got to know, as growing up. They were the family that and they were, I think, the inspiration, well, obviously the inspiration for my writing this book, because it was, they had fascinating stories of
Yeah.
the earlier days, it was.
And as you were growing up, what number are you? You said out of 6 children?
There's 7 children, and I'm the oldest girl. I have an older
Oh,
brother.
okay. So you probably, as the old, I'm also the oldest granddaughter on both sides. And
Okay.
and like you have more time with, I think, your grandparents than some
Uh-huh.
of the younger ones do.
Yeah.
Both
Yep.
both because there are as many of you when you're young, and also because,
Right.
just length of life. And
Mhm.
so
Yep.
how were those stories transmitted? Like, was that something that was part of your family culture, part of family dinner? What did that look like?
You know what it really was, and I didn't really appreciate this at first, for many years, actually. My mom was such a historian in her mind. She just absolutely loved history, and there's a book this thick that she was the editor of in our little county, that's just full of stories of all the pioneers from this little county. And she was, so that's my mom. So it kind of, it kind of stuck with me. And she had interviewed my grandfather, who was an old cowboy, came from Missouri in the late 1800s, and, traveled all over and went to the World's Fair in St. Louis back in '04. Just really a character. But my mom interviewed him and got all these stories of where he had been and what he had done, all of his travels, etc. How he met my grandmother on a train, so I had this outline of I had a pretty clear outline of a story of what his life had been. So that part of it was, that part of it was just it was like it just had to be written down.
Yeah. What a gift from your mom, and for her to have done that work. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
So you weren't necessarily raised with that knowledge or those stories. You came to them later?
Sort of not so much. We met, they were family, and I knew a lot. There was actually 2 other sibling, grandpa's brother and sister also lived in town. And so there would be talk, there would be stories. And it was a second cousin that lived in the area. But I learned much more from just what my mom's interviews with grandpa.
Wow.
And then, of course, there was the other side of it. My grandmother, grandpa's wife, who I never knew because she died in 1915 when my dad was born. So then the question was, how do I get to know her? How can I put her as a person in this book? And what I had was her diary. That's all I had. I had mementos, I had things, but I had a several year diary that went right up to the time actually that she and grandpa got married. So I had, I met her, I kind of met her that way. And that's how I was able to really put her into the book in a way that was, I felt like it was fairly real, because she was pretty open in her diary about, it wasn't long. It was short little pieces for each day, but you got a picture of what was going on in her life. Pretty
Yeah. Did you know that diary existed as you were growing up, or is it something you discovered later in life?
When I was probably in my, I don't know, late 20s, 30s, I went with my mom. They had moved grandma's trunk. So Grandma Florrie's trunk that grandpa just, when she died, he just left everything in it. Everything went in this trunk. And so it was this amazing museum of 1915. And in it, so I went through it one time. I was going through with my mom and went through it and found several things, including this incredible velvet dress that I took a picture. I had to get a picture of myself wearing it because it was just
Yeah.
elegant. And this diary, and it was, the diary was such a, I said, "Mom, can I take this? Can I take this?" She said, "Sure, sure, sure." So I did, and it was a treasure trove of getting to know this person that of course, I only knew her in a way just from my dad, knew who my dad turned out, but my dad never knew her either, so it's just
Yeah.
who he was.
Was your dad her only child?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, first child, and he was a month old when she died, so he never knew her either. It was, but the diary was fabulous.
Yeah. Yeah, and you think there's not even any older siblings to pass down stories about his mom,
Right.
and so your only connection to her was your grandfather, who it sounds like maybe just closed everything down and
Didn't really talk about her. I mean, when mom, asked details, he would talk about how we met on the train, so I had a lot of that. I had some pretty good detail of, the sort of the facts of it, but but of course, yeah, he wasn't a chatty guy, let me
Yeah.
just say. He was
Well, so it's so interesting because it sounds like you have these little pieces you collected as a child and a young adult, and then, you have this writing that your mom did. What moment was the spark that you just decided, "I'm gonna put all this together and tell their story?"
well, part of it was, I finished the Nepal book, and that was satisfying just because it was this thing in me that had to come out. But I think it was going over her diary, thinking, I mean, I knew I had a lot of information that mama gathered about grandpa. But when I really got around to looking at this diary and just thinking, I know this woman, I know this woman. I can write from her point of view because she really did this in her diary. And that was what, it sort of completed the picture. I knew my grandpa, I knew my great aunt Kate who lived with him, who was a dear who I adored. And I knew my parents, and so I could write I could write all those from having known them. But with Florrie, it was I could do it because I had the diary.
I love that. So I mean, I know you've written this, but I would love for you to just tell the story of Florrie in a few minutes, like how you would describe her and her journey to Montana.
Well, she came from a fairly, I think, my sense is a kind of a poor family, lived in a part of the south of London in a place called Croydon. I think it was fairly low income area. But she decided to become a nurse. She went to nursing school, I'm sure in London, and sought her fortune in the West. And she gets to the East Coast, and it turns out that there's lots of private duty jobs for nurses. She would be hired by a rich, wealthy people to take care of the old man was getting kind of sickly, or I mean, that's the interesting part of her diary was to see who she was taking care of. And sometimes the woman that just drove her crazy was this very neurotic woman, but she just felt like that she felt like she had to take care of this woman because she needed her, and just that whole series of working with people, and she liked it, but at the same time, you get a sense in as the diary goes on that she really wanted her own family. She really wanted something else, and so she took this. She was on a train, and I'm sure she was with one of her wealthy patients, but met my grandpa on a train because he would take his cattle back to usually, I think it was either Chicago or Minneapolis to sell in the fall. So she met him on a train, and they corresponded for at least 2 years
Oh,
before
wow.
finally, he sent her tickets and said, "I want you to come out and see me. Do you want to come and see me?" And so she did, and she was only there for, it looked like from the diary, it looked like maybe 10 days. And at the end of that time, they were engaged, So I think she just was ready for another kind of life. And this was another kind of life. I mean, this was
Yeah.
very different kind of place at that point in time. The ranch where Andy had my grandpa had, started. I mean, it was a fully functioning ranch with several ranch hands, so we didn't have to be there all the time, but it was, across the Yellowstone, and it was kind of out there in the sticks. And even the little town of Sydney, which is the town that my grandpa started, he was a bit of an entrepreneur. He wanted to kind of build this and that. He had a saloon, he had an ice cream shop, he had, things like that. I thought at first that they probably were gonna live on the farm, but they didn't. He built her a house in town.
It's a story that I think is so easy to romanticize, right?
Yeah.
Like, to romanticize this poor girl from London, and she, comes to America and makes her way out west, and yet there were probably a lot of hardships living in
Mhm.
such an isolated place. Is there any hint in her journal of feeling that?
She stopped writing her diary after they were married. It was only a period. They were married in 1913. She died in 1915, and she had a kidney disease that probably she'd had for a long time.
Hmm.
And I think what happened was over the period of, those 2 years, well, she got pregnant, and pregnancy it often makes kidney disease a lot worse. And so, my guess is that she was from the headline story in the Sydney Herald, the little paper. It was written by the editor, and it was this very sweet story about her and how she had become such a part of the community, and how, this is the day she died. I mean, it was the day after she died,
Yeah.
that everybody knew it. And so you got a sense that she really had done a reasonable job of fitting into this very different culture than she was used to.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh,
but at the
lovely.
same time, she had 2 years, and that was it.
Did you know growing up that she had been a nurse, and did that inform your choice of occupation at all, or was that a happy coincidence?
I did know she was a nurse because, for one thing, I had, we had these very, and I'm sure I've seen them when I was little, nurses would carry with them their own works, right? So, needles and a little, boilable syringe and all that. And there were little things around that had been hers. So maybe I assume that had something to do with it.
Well, it's interesting that when you think about, like, choosing a life and living a life, and yet this practice of reflecting on the lives of those who came before you. It's such an interesting exercise to engage in. And so to do that with Florrie, who you didn't know, is
Uh-huh.
probably an interesting exercise. But then you also included, of course, your grandfather Andy in this story,
Mhm.
and you knew him. And so
Mhm.
how did the process of writing this story change your perspective of him that you had from growing up?
The thing is that growing up, he didn't talk much. As I said, he was this very taciturn, not grumpy exactly, but he would just sit there smoking his pipe and playing solitaire. I mean, I knew what he was like. I do remember one time when, for some reason, I was a little hole in the wall just listening, but he had an old friend from Wyoming, from his days in Wyoming, when he was a cowboy, and he was living. This was an era when it was all kinds of Butch Cassidy, and that was the days of, lots of drama in, Old West kind of drama. And he was down there. And so this guy came to visit and they were talking about I just remember the hole in the wall gang.
Yeah.
But that was, they just were kind of reminiscing about those days because it was somebody that he knew when he did his cowboy days in Wyoming. And other than that, he didn't talk to my mom when my mom asked him specific questions, but I just don't remember that much detail about what about him talking about his life. So it was kind of an interesting, almost a dichotomy.
Yeah, we had a woman on the podcast talking about Wyoming, and I think it was her grandfather that was part of the hole in the wall gang.
Whoa, interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
So I love that too. Like when you think about, just a few short generations ago, in
Right.
these isolated places, there are people who knew each other
Yep.
that 2 or 3 generations later, their families have no idea that they had those
Right.
connections. Yeah.
And one generation later, yeah.
Yeah. So talk to me about the ranch in Montana. Your grandfather established this. It sounds like he did a beautiful job of creating this, legacy in this place. How has that continued in the family?
So I grew up on the ranch and it was I as I think about it now, I mean, when I go back now, buildings are falling down and it doesn't look anything like I remember, but what I remember of it was quite an establishment. He had, a big granary, and even now the granary is fine, and you climb up a ladder to the loft in the granary, and here's just tons and tons and tons of horse collars and a bunch of the trappings of the harnesses and stuff that they use for the workhorses. Still there, still there today. And just as so the that and right next to it is the old shop, and that was a lot of the old tools that they used and the horseshoes and, shoeing the horses and all that. Oh, and then there was a little blacksmith shop, kind of a little hut. It was covered. I don't remember what it was like, but it had an anvil, it had a forge, it had, we'd go in there and play, and we'd roll the forge around, and the breeze would go out in the just old stuff like that, and a chicken house, and of course lots of barns and the milking barn, and so it was just I had a look at kind of what it was like, I think, from where my dad was growing up. It changed because we didn't have chickens after a while. We had chickens when I was little, but then grandpa wasn't able to take care of them after a while. It was, so I had that. I had his I had what he did. I saw what he had done to build up this ranch. And that kind of was part of it. Just felt like it felt like it was a part of my story, was definitely the family story. And that's what I just kind of wanted to get it. I wanted to make it a little more real to people that had never been there, had never seen it, had never, and so many people, of course, haven't experienced anything like it, because it's an old ranch.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it still in the family?
Yeah, my brother, he actually, when he married, he moved to a house on another part of the land because things had gotten a little messy. There was a lot of old equipment and all that sort of stuff. He wanted a kind of a new start, but it's still there. And the house that I grew up in is still there.
Wow.
We go and visit it once in a while. And actually one of the reasons I like to go back, to that house, we have a room in the basement that when my grandpa's house, which is this old ranch house, started falling down, basically, it was just, nobody was living in it. We moved grandpa's books into the family house, down into this room in the basement. And I love going there. He was a reader. He bought book. I'm sure every time he went to Chicago or Minneapolis, he brought home books because there are hundreds of books, of all kinds and shapes. Um, in fact, I brought some of them back with me here, just thinking some of these might be valuable. And I looked just really quite recently, last month, I was looking at this book the name of the book is UGRR, Underground Railroad.
Mm,
This book are published in 1872.
wow.
So I start looking it up on the web, and it's a big deal. it is a big deal. Now there's a museum in Philadelphia that would like it, so they're gonna send some kind of special, carrier so I can send it to them. But, he did that. He just had he had a whole bunch of Zane Grey books and Teddy Roosevelt had books, right? He always Teddy Roosevelt books. So, it gave me yet another look at my grandpa,
Yeah.
that he had this interest. He had such interest in the rest of the world, and that's one way that sitting out even, once my grandmother died, they had a house in town and he was, he had building things and all that. He just moved out to the ranch. But he still got books, he'd still read. He still had some contact with the world. Um, and just looking at this range of books is kind of mind blowing. I think I'm a reader. I wasn't a reader as much as he was,
Well, and yeah, for him to just use that place to then use those books as a window out into the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Wow. But that does give you another sense of him as a person, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. For sure it did.
Are there any traditions or anything you connect with Montana or with your family from growing up that persists today, either in your life or in the life of your broader family?
There were all kinds of traditions from my growing up that I don't get to see much of anymore. Branding was a big one. Branding was, the day that, all the neighbors, so we had the acreage that our cattle were. Grandma had, well, it was my dad too, had about, I guess, 150 cattle, and each with calves, and they would be out in this rather large, several thousand acre um, hills. That was the pasture, and so they had to get all rounded up usually it was June or around then, to the calves were big enough that they could be branded. But that's a big job. It's thousands of acres to try to bring all these cattle in, and so it's a community thing, and so at least it seemed like there was usually about 6 or 7 of the neighbors knew they would have a role. I mean, they knew what part of the pasture they would go through. Everybody mounted up early, early in the morning. They brought their horses from, ways away, and within, 2 or 3 hours, they were able to take over their part of the pasture, bring in the cattle, and bring them into a corral and, go on with the rest of the day. But all that kind of thing, I don't it's not something that I have. The only thing that came close was and I think was one reason that I decided I had to have the house at Elbow Creek. Elbow Creek is the place in Montana where it's an old ranch, much much smaller than the one I grew up on, but it is a ranch, has been a working ranch for many, many years, and the neighbors were the old timers that really did the ranching. And so, it just was so nice to be able to have a place that I would go to, and the neighbors are still there, and I always see them when I'm there, it was like going home, and home is different now because there's, very, very different, community of people than when I was there. But Elbow Creek, which is where we have our little it's kind of a shack, but we love it. But Elbow Creek is much more like home than, when I was growing up. So that's been kind of fun to have that.
I love that. It sounds like that draw back to Montana, you've been able to kind of recreate that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I yearn to go if I can't get back, I just yearn to go back and see, meet the neighbors and just sit out and listen to the nothing. I mean, the nothing, a little bit of breeze, because we're pretty far off any roads that are used very much. And so, it's just it's great. It's a little step back in time, which I
Yeah.
enjoy.
Yeah, I've been to Montana a few times. It's straight up I-15 from where I am, and
Yeah, yeah.
I
Yeah,
always
yeah.
feel that stillness, but
Mhm.
also just that
Nice.
that expanse of peace.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, Montana's a beautiful place, and what a place to grow up and to be able to tell the stories of that place. Like, thank you for putting that out into the world.
Well, thank you for I mean, It is true that it's something you don't want it, you want to lose it. You don't want that way of life to be totally lost. And there are certainly books about it, but
Yes.
ours it's special, and so
Montana is a unique place though, because it still has some of the feel of a generation or two ago
yeah,
that
no, it
some
really
of the other
does.
states have lost.
Yeah, so
Well, and
what?
it's a unique family story. The
Yeah.
the story of Florrie and her journey to get there, and Andy and his journey
Yeah.
to get there, like, and then just capturing a little bit of what your growing up was. And thank you for sharing that with us. I love
Mhm.
it.
Oh, it's quite enjoyable, I have to say.
Studio sponsored by Ancestry.